Good day, fish tankers. We all know those days. Buckets all over the place, tripping over hoses, sweat pouring down your face, splashes of dirty tank water on the Persian carpet, and off there, somewhere in the corner, silently stands your spouse contemplating your marriage. I'm talking, of course, about water change day. Would you like to do less water changes? Believe it or not, there are a couple of ways to do that. Stick around and find out. Just quickly before we go further, this is not a sponsored video. I paid for all the products that you see in this video, even the sweatband. I asked Nike, they said sorry, they're not sponsoring field athletes right now. So all the products that I show you are simply the products that I use. I wasn't sponsored. And secondly, before we begin any subject, we should answer the why. We should always be like little children, always asking why we do things. Now, I keep planted tanks with a lot of fish in, as you can see, and I don't do water changes any more regularly than once every 4th week. Now, what I would like to go from you guys in the comment section is the size of a tank that you have, what fish do you keep in it, and how regularly do you do water changes, and how much water do you change. Share that in the comment section so we can learn from each other. Now, why would you want to do less water changes? I see this can be a topic that can be controversial, that can be polarizing, but there is a bit of subjectivity to it as well, but there's also objective things. Now, please don't drag me to the village square in the Rome of Fishkeeping and stone me. It's not a question of, oh, Drux, you're lazy, and now the fishes suffer for your laziness, because they can survive in suboptimal water quality, but that's not really their best life. That's not what I'm advocating at all. We have to give our domestic denizens of the deep the best lives that they can have, so there's no compromise on water quality. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying you can sometimes maintain optimum water quality while not breaking your back changing water. Stick around to the end. I will show you a handy tip to make those water changes easier when you do them, but I'm going to show you ways to do less water changes. Now, it's also essential to understand, why do we do water changes? Now, we do water changes to dilute pollution that have low levels of toxicity. We all know ammonia and nitrite, that's highly toxic. It will kill fish. That's not what water changes are for, except when you have an emergency, a kid dumped a whole can of food in the tank, or somehow your biological filter crashed and now you have to take emergency measures. But we do water changes to take out the things that will only become toxic over a long period of time in big quantities. And there are many different things, like we need to replenish minerals in water, various waste products, also hormones that fish secrete. But the major thing, the major reason why we change water is to dilute a byproduct of a nitrification process, and that's called nitrate, NO3, not to be confused with nitrite. Nitrate, we do water changes to dilute the nitrate. Now, what should be your optimum levels of nitrate? That's also a bit controversial. Different fish have different needs. I can just tell you what works for me. For me, I want to keep those nitrate levels below 25 parts per million. If it hits 25 ppm, that's when I always did a water change. Now, these days my nitrates stay way below it, but we'll get into that later. Now, in the beginning, when you start to keep fish, back eons ago in the first half of the 90s, I ran a pet store, and you have people going out there with their first fish tank, and later they buy their fish. Obviously, we did it the right way. We didn't sell them the fish and told them to put all the fish in the next day. We told them about the nitrogen cycle, of course, but the thing is, that person rarely buys test kits. You may be going to test his pH in the store to see if there's not something radically weird with his water. But they rarely buy test kits, never mind nitrate test kits. Back then it was hard even to find nitrate test kits here in South Africa. But so we give them a general rule of thumb, and a general rule of thumb, the general wisdom in for fish keeping is do a partial water change every week of between 25 to 50%. I always tell the youngsters just starting out, change 30%, just change a third of your water every week. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's going to be very difficult to go wrong if you are doing that. But it's maybe not optimal. So why would we at all do less water changes, except for the obvious that it's a big job if you have many aquariums. If you have one, it's really nothing. Why should we do less water changes? Because water is a scarce resource. It's not free. It may be cheap relative to other things that you pay a municipality for, but it is not. It does cost something, and it is a scarce resource that we should preserve. We don't have it in abundance in most parts of the world. I'm in South Africa. South Africa is quite an arid country, and here in the Western Cape, where I stay, quite a few years ago, we had a huge crisis where Cape Town was going to become one of the first major cities in the world that run out of fresh water. So we had severe water restrictions. So that is a reason why you want to do less water changes while keeping your water conditions optimal. So those are the reasons why. Okay guys, so here's one thing that you can do for starters. First thing, optimize your water changes. How do you know that you may not already be doing too many water changes? You may also be doing too little water changes, but how are you going to know if you don't test your water? And for that, the essential thing is that test kit on the right, NO3 nitrite. Test your nitrites. I also test the pH because I have soft water, and sometimes with soft water, very little pH, the pH can suddenly drop. So I test the pH as well before I do a water change, as well as the nitrites. But the nitrites are the most essential thing. With a pH that I do here, that can drop, sometimes my pH can go very low. I've solved that problem. I have dirted tanks. I've got a little bit of bone meal in the dirt component of a substrate, and that buffers my pH up. So I no longer have that problem. Now test your nitrite. I've had this little cube tank in front of which these test kits are standing. At that stage, it was not that substrate, it had aqua soil in, but there was only a single beta and not much else. And I just kept doing weekly water changes because I thought it's a small tank. You know what people say, the water is more unstable, pollutants build up quicker. But there was only a single beta in it at that stage. And when I tested the nitrates, I couldn't find any. There were no nitrates. So I was doing water changes when I didn't need to. Test those nitrates, and as I say, if it hits 20 or 25, you need to do a water change. If it's less than that, you can still wait another week and you test it again. So see what your optimal time period is with a fish that you keep, with the size of your tank, to do water changes, because you might be doing water changes and it's really not necessary. So use the nitrite test kit and just see, maybe there's no nitrite or hardly measurable nitrite present. This particular test kit only started measuring at 10 ppm. I had the JBL before that one ran out, and that it started testing at 5 ppm and 3 ppm. But if your nitrates are still very low, there's no need to do a water change. Then you can wait another week. That way you optimize it. Okay guys, now the other thing that we can do is to limit the input into the tank to make the bioload less. What's the first thing that we put into our tanks? Fish, of course. That's the first thing we think of, not the first thing we put into a new tank. But if you keep less fish, you will have less bioload, which will result in less nitrate, so you won't have to change water as often. There you see my bookshelf tank. It's only 5 gallons, 20 litre. But there's only 4 tiny little fish in there. They're pea puffers, they're little micro predators, so they're absolutely tiny, and they don't cause a high bioload. There's nothing else in there, because pea puffers, in my experience, any puffers, they're not good community fish, so they stay there on their own. So that's the first thing. Keep less fish, then you will have less bioload and you will have less need for water changes. And apart from keeping less fish, you can also keep smaller fish. These pea puffers, as I've said, are tiny. They're smaller than my fingernail. These 4 little pea puffers together are, I think, not even the weight of a betta, or maybe about the size of one betta. If I rolled them all together like clay and made one fish out of them, there will be one small female betta. So they're tiny little fish. So you can keep less fish and you can keep smaller fish. A school of neon tetras have much less bioload than, say, a big angelfish, never mind a big Oscar. So if you keep less fish and you keep smaller fish, you'll have less bioload, less need for water changes. That brings me to the other thing that we put into our aquariums, and that is, of course, food. And simply put, feed less. I used to feed my fish twice a day, dry food in the morning and then some frozen food in the evenings. It's not necessary unless you are power feeding and trying to raise small fish up to be bigger fish as quickly as possible. For your normal established tank, it's not necessary. I feed my fish once a day, as much as they can consume. Within 3 minutes, the food must be gone. I feed different kinds of food, so you cover all your different fish's needs, but you don't need to feed all the time. Once a day is enough. Some people will either say feed every second day or every third day. That can also work, I find, in a community tank. When you have fish with different sizes, you can get sometimes, for my big tank where there's a big angel there and some cardinal tetras, you might have a cardinal tetra disappearing if you use that sort of feeding sequence. So I prefer feeding the fish once a day, what they can consume in a few minutes and no more. And that brings me to the next point. That brings us to the next issue, and that is feed quality food. I'm not sponsored by any of these. These are just the foods that I use. You'll see all the usual brands there. We've got Tetra, we've got Ikari, there's some Vibrabites, we've got Fish Science, more Ikari. You can see different food for the different fish's needs. We've got some sinking tablets, and we've got some Attison's Beta Pro tablets. And we've got frozen foods, we've got bloodworms, there's some Cyclops. That's a great food for little nano fish, like my Ember Tetras, love them. Not really for bigger fish. And of course, Artemia, frozen brine shrimp. So feed quality foods. Now, generally I find you get what you pay for. Now, I don't know how many of you have dogs. I have a dachshund called Lulu. Now, she eats vet food, and there's been the occasion when on weekend when I run out of food and I quickly have to pop down to the 7-Eleven or the Spar and just get a bag of ordinary non-royal dog food and feed her that till the weekend is over. And I don't know if you guys notice what happens when you do that. The dog just poops more, not more regularly necessarily, but you'll notice that your dog will produce a lot bigger poop. There's a lot more going in that can't be digested, and like they say in statistics, rubbish in, rubbish out. So if you feed the cheap food that you'll get on your supermarket shelf next to the generic dog food, if you feed that, it'll keep your fish alive, but they're going to excrete a lot more phosphates and other things into the water that you really don't want. So rubbish in, rubbish out. I recommend just choose a premium brand that works for you. Usually better. It doesn't always have to be a brand. There's some people that import on their own, but there's some Fish Science as well. That's also a brand that I've discovered that uses insect meal. But feed them a quality food. It doesn't help you feed less, but you still feed rubbish. Feed them a variety of quality foods, and you will have less bioload, less bad things being excreted into the water, and the fish will make the most of the nutrition that they do get. The other thing that we put into our aquariums, of course, are fertilizers, all kinds of different fertilizers. Now here's some of the brands that I've used, not sponsored once again, and I have used Scape Complete, for instance, as prescribed on a daily basis. What I found was that my crypt started melting. I don't think it's a product as such, maybe it was something else in my tank. By all accounts, it's a very good product. Local is lekker, it's locally manufactured as well. But I changed to dosing it weekly. I do water column fertilization weekly, not daily, if I do it at all. Mostly my fertilizer is down in the substrate. I have dirted substrates, and where I don't, I have root tabs. And when it comes to water column fertilization, I keep it to the absolute bare minimum, if at all. It's mostly just for the epiphyte plants. The reason why there's an approach, a high-tech sort of approach to fertilizers, that the plants will only grow as much as the element of which there is released allows them to. So you dose everything to a max. There's sort of a shotgun approach, and then the water changes take care of any surpluses that might occur. So if you're going to want to do less water changes, you're going to have a more lean fertilizing regime. That is quite important. So keep that in mind as well. Fertilizer is another thing that we add to our aquariums. The other part of doing less water changes, we have chatted about putting less things in our tank, the bioload, the fish, what we feed them, the fertilizer. But now we have to look at things that consume nitrate, NO3. That's the other end of it, because most aquariums have aerobic filtration. That takes ammonia to nitrite, and the rest is done by water changes. But we also have things that can consume nitrate. And one is plants, many plants. And I'm not talking about 1 or 2 plants in your aquarium. You've got to get as many in there as you can, bar taking out the swimming space for a fish. They need some swimming space too, but you need to put in as many different plants as you can. There I have sort of a shotgun approach. I put in all kinds of low-tech plants, and whatever grows, grows. And as you can see here, the crypts are doing well. The Vallisneria is absolutely thriving. The Anubias are doing okay as well. The Java fern, not so much. But I don't really mind. I let whatever take over. And growing plants, plants that are growing, plants that are living, not a few plants dying, do consume nitrates, and it also consumes ammonia. So less ammonia going into your nitrogen cycle results in less nitrates at the end. And a lot of plants will help keep that water in tip-top shape as well. Plants help quite a bit, believe me. Now another thing that consumes nitrate is something that I picked up from Father Fish. There's also a small little channel, Jay's Aquarium, where he explains it well. And that is a deep dirted substrate. Now the dirt is something that we sweep out of our homes in South Africa. It simply means swale. It's covered by the rim of a tank there at the bottom. You can't see it. I'll go up to my top little cube tank that hasn't got a rim. You can see it better there. Now we have a rimless tank. I'm sitting in front of a cube tank now, and there you can see that's a deep dirted substrate. The first inch is a swale mixture. You can use organic potting soil on its own. I use a mixture of peat, organic potting soil, organic compost, a little bit of bone meal to buffer my pH, and a tiny pinch of Epsom salts. And then you cover that with sand, not coarse gravel. It doesn't have to be play sand. That is about, the granule size is about 1 millimeter. The largest is 2 millimeters. So it's a sort of a sand that is coarser than play sand, but not gravel. Gravel won't work, you need sand. So you put a 2-inch layer of sand on top. So it's 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters of soil mixture. Dirt, as the Americans call it, covered by 5 centimeters, 2 inches of sand. So the whole substrate must have a total thickness of at least 7.5 centimeters. That's 3 inches. And what does that do? What it does is that gradually, it takes about somewhere between 3 weeks and a month and a half, let's say 6 weeks to start working. At first you've got to do those weekly or even twice weekly water changes because the nitrate will shoot up. But then, as time goes by, in the lower part of that substrate, and the plants growing there and using that dirt as nutrients, in the lower part of the substrate there's very, very little oxygen, and it becomes anaerobic, and anaerobic bacteria eats nitrate, NO3. So it starts reducing your nitrate levels, and pretty soon you'll see the nitrate is hardly detectable. Now my tanks, I test them before I do a water change. I do a 40% water change every 4 weeks, and when I test the nitrate, it doesn't show up on the Sierra test. Sierra only registers at 10 ppm, so it's less than that. It looks like 0 on the Sierra test. I've used the JBL test, and there I can detect 3 ppm of nitrate. And as you can see, my tanks are quite well stocked. Some would say slightly overstocked. And so there's a lot of fish here, and there's some larger fish, not large fish, but the biggest one is an angel, and some smallish juvenile clown loaches. So it's not all nano fish, but there's a lot of fish. And there's a lot of plants, but I also have these deep substrates. And by the time I do a water change, the nitrate reading that I get in all of my tanks are around 3 ppm. So there's hardly any nitrates. So I'm not doing that water change even to dilute the nitrates. It's just to dilute whatever I may not be seeing in the tank, you know, like hormones being excreted, fertilizer that's maybe become a little bit excessive, even though I dose very lean, things like that, things that I may not know about. And the fish do seem to enjoy the water changes. You know, they play around in a slightly cooler water and they're a little bit more active. So the fish do seem to enjoy those water changes. So to be safe, I do the water changes every 4th week. But before I had these deep substrates and the plants growing like they're growing now, this was a weekly thing for me, and the nitrates were much higher. That was to keep them under 20 ppm. They would be 25 roundabout there after every week. So I had to keep changing water. So these deep dirted substrates, a lot of people criticize them. I was very skeptical, but I tried them out and it does work. You've got to give it a little bit of time, as I've said, but 4 to 6 weeks and you'll see it starts working. But you've got to test your nitrates in order to be able to tweak that. But this is something that really does over time reduce your nitrates. There are other ways. You have companies that claim all sorts of things for filter media that's put together in such a way that the pores are very deep or shallow or whatever, so that there's less water movement through it and it creates pockets for anaerobic bacteria to reduce nitrate. I'm very skeptical towards those filter medias because I can't really test it. And you know, you're putting that filter media in your filter, which is a high oxygen environment designed for aerobic bacteria. So I'm a bit skeptical on those filter media that claims to reduce nitrate. I think it will work if you put it in a custom-made, very, very slow-moving filter. But I find this is easier and it works much better. And then there's a guy called Kevin Novak out there that propagates the use of plenums and biocenosis clarification baskets, all sorts of things with undergravel filter plates and kitty litter and clay, which I find quite interesting, but I haven't tried those myself. So what works for me is a combination of the plants and the deep dirted substrate. That definitely helps to reduce the need for water changes. But even if you don't have that, if you keep less fish, if you keep smaller fish, if you feed less, that will already make a big difference. Okay guys, so what can we say in conclusion? There are ways out there that we can use to reduce the nitrate or almost eliminate the nitrate, reduce it quite greatly, that is only trace amounts left. And that will enable us to do less water changes. There are some people that claim that they hardly ever do water changes. We've all seen the video of that shop there, I think it's in San Francisco, with the deep substrates. They don't do water changes. And I can understand, because water is expensive. We need to conserve it. Water conditioner, anti-chlorine dechlorinator is expensive. But we must always remember that we have to give our fish optimum conditions. We can't do less water changes and let the nitrates go into the hundreds and the fish still live and they look all right at the eye test, but we know that's not optimal conditions. So we have to have optimal water conditions. My biggest test kit are my fish, and my fish are very healthy, they're very happy. I've never had as little problems as I have these days with these planted deep substrate tanks. And also my fish are regularly breeding, and even in the community tank I've had a little emperor tetra surviving and growing up, and now in the tank behind me here on my left I discovered a little baby cherry bulb the other day that's grown up to a size and that's now surviving here in the community tank. So that tells me that my fish are happy and I'm doing something right. But if you are going to have lots of big African cichlids that's crowded together, or big South Americans, if you're only going to have a substrate that's maybe 4 centimeters, 2 inches, inch and a half deep, with nothing else in it but a few root tabs and maybe 1 or 2 plants, or maybe no plants at all, just a few plastic plants, and you have a lot of fish, you are going to have to do more water changes. Then you're going to be on the weekly water change regime of 25 to 50%, depending on how your nitrates go. So for certain instances, you're still going to have to do these regular water changes. If you do some of the principles that I've talked about in this video, you can do less water changes. But then again, if you're a breeder and you're trying to power feed baby fish to grow them up as quickly as possible, so you can offset them to other fish keepers or pet shops or aquarium shops, then you have to do a lot of water changes. So it depends on your individual circumstances. Always test to see where your water's at. And when you do a water change, don't make it difficult on yourself. Here's the bonus tip that I've told you I'll tell you in the end. And it's something very, very logical, but I thought I'll put it in here because I've seen so many people breaking their backs with buckets. I've seen fish keepers complain that are sort of my age and even beyond that, oh, my back, I've got fish keeper's back. Don't make it hard on yourself, guys. Just get yourself a good old garden hose, cut yourself off a long piece as long as you need, have several. Then when you do have to do a water change, you put the hose in the garden because you don't want to waste. Old aquarium water is great for watering garden plants. You get yourself one of these hose clips. Most pet stores will carry them. Just a cheap little thing. You put the garden hose in the clip and you clip it, you screw it into the side of a tank, and then you put the hose in to whatever depth you want to remove the water. Don't put it in right on the bottom because you might forget about the hose and you drain the entire tank and have fish flopping on the bottom. And then you also have to be aware not to suck out the little fish. So I always put a strainer of a canister filter at the end of a garden hose, the part that goes into the tank. So I'll clip it to the tank. I'll have this hanging into the tank at the depth where I want to take the water out. So the siphon will automatically break when I've taken out 40% of water or 50% or 30%, whatever I want to take out. I'll tweak the height there. I don't have to worry about fish being sucked in. It's secure on the end of my tank, and I'm walking around the other end in the garden just watering the plants. And once you are done with that, you just reverse the process. I like to just pull this one up, and I'll keep the strainer on because that'll break the water. And I'll take the garden hose into my house, and I'll have one of these clips that you just use for your garden hose. I'll put the garden hose onto this. I'll just connect it in here. Then it's onto this. If it's an outside tap, you always have those clip-ons adjusters on the outside tap. I use my indoor tap because I like to use a mixer tap. I put a little bit of a hot water mixed into the cold water, especially in winter, so I don't give a fish a temperature shock. I just touch by feel, and if the water is more or less the same as the tank water using the mixer tap, then I just go and pour it and hose it right back into the tank. Little tip for this, you mustn't go and do something else. Make sure that you stand there and turn off the water because you can cause an almighty flood, and then your spouse might just decide that this fish keeping marriage is not for them anymore. But your indoor taps, your mixer taps especially, they're not like your outdoor taps with the rims on the outside, the rim is on the inside. And here's a very neat little indoor tap adjuster. I'll try and find a link on Take-A-Lot. It's a little bit pricey, but you see you can unscrew this, and then it screws into the inside of your indoor mixer tap, and then it's secure, and you can just use your indoor taps to fill up your aquarium again. It's a very nifty and very nice little thing to have. So I hope that will make your water change days a little bit easier. That's what I've got to say. It's been a rather long video, but I hope you find value in it. If you did, please hit the thumbs up, give us a like, I'll really appreciate it, and please subscribe. And until I see you guys again, keep on taking care of those domestic denizens of the deep.